Recall that we ran into trouble when we were first learning square roots when we ran across something like the square root of -9. We talked about how there was no real number that is the square root of -9, because a square comes about from multiplying something times itself. But if you multiply any real number times itself, you're going to get a positive number. So you can't take any real number and multiply by itself and get -9. However, this imaginary unit now gives us the power to figure out what the square root of -9 would be. We write this as the square root of 9 times -1, and we can split this up into the square root of 9 times the square root of -1. The square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of -1 is I. Likewise, if we want the square root of -4, we get 4 times -1, which is the square root of 4 times the square root of -1, giving us 2i. Sometimes our examples are not going to work out quite as cleanly as the two we just looked at. In this case, if we break up the square root of -2 and write it as 2 times -1, we get the square root of 2 times the square root of -1, and the square root of -1 is I, but there's really no simplifying we can do with the square root of 2. So we would write this as I times the square root of 2. And generally we want to write the I in front. If you write it on the back end, it can be a little confusing sometimes as to whether or not the I is inside the square root or out of it. So if you write it in front, there's no confusion. As for the square root of -24, we can think of this as being the square root of -1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. Well, the square root of 4 becomes a 2. The square root of -1 becomes I, and there's really not much we can do with the square root of 6. So this becomes 2i times the square root of 6.